Okay, class. This is descriptive statistics, and this lecture series is broken up into 4 or 5 different parts. In this section, we're going to be talking about what is testing, why do we test, and we're going to talk a little bit about the rationale behind it. So, first of all, why is measurement important? What are we going to get out of testing? So, why are we going to be doing this? So, standardized assessment, in the book it tells you how that it's used primarily in educational decision-making processes. Now, this can be whether you are entering college, as in your SAT and ACTs. What does that tell us? Those scores tell us not really what you know so much, but how successful you're going to be in college. What are the probabilities? What about for those of you that have looked into doing a master's? What about the GRE? It pretty much tells you the same thing. It gives the school that you're going to be going to a good idea of how well you're going to be able to do the work. And it's not just an intellectual factor. It is more of students who do well in these areas tend to graduate. And because that is really what they're looking at in that area. So, but in PK through 12, we're looking at it not just to see how successful students are going to be, but really, what do they know? How are they going to be able to function? So we're looking at academics, we're looking at functionality. Now, and now the book, I think, is sometimes a little unclear on this one particular area, because many people believe that testing is used only for academics, and that what is that IQ going to tell you? All right? And so it's a very gray area, because there are a lot of different kinds of theories about this. But what educators need to understand about measurement are these basic 4 areas. All right, you need to know how to pick out a test. What are those different tests going to tell you about that student? And is that what you're looking for? Is that the information that you're looking for? You need to know the basic principles of measurement, which we're going to go into more in the oncoming chapters. So, but basically, basic principles, we're talking about statistics. Now, I know that that's kind of a scary idea for many people. Statistics can be very difficult to understand. But what I'm more interested in is, do you understand the outcomes? We also need to look at those administration techniques. I think this is very, very important, because administration of a test does not mean just asking the questions. There's a certain way to ask the questions. There's also a certain understanding of, you must follow the way the test was written or intended to be given. And then the scoring procedures. If scoring is done incorrectly, you're going to get an incorrect score. That kind of makes sense. But it isn't just adding up the ones and zeros. It's really following the way that the test was supposed to be administered so that you can score it correctly. So, basically, when you're looking at assessment, you need to figure out, why am I testing? Why am I doing this in the first place? And I know as a school psychologist, that was one of the first questions on our forms, was, okay, what are you looking for? Why do you want me to test this student? And many people believe that it's only for eligibility, but that's only part of the puzzle. We have eligibility for IEPs. If they do not qualify for special education services, they might qualify as a student with a Section 504. But I'm primarily going to go over the IEP sections of eligibility. So basically, the purpose of testing is to determine, if you're looking at eligibility, whether students have a disability, and if that disability impacts their education to the point that they are not being successful in school. Now, they could have a disability, but it's not affecting them to that point. That's when you would go and look at the Section 504. Now, one of the things that I want you to look at is, I've given you a handout. It's called Figure 3.1, the steps in the assessment process. And this is one of the things that we're going to be looking at. So, one of the first things that we're looking at, okay, first of all, we have a child who's not doing well in school. We need to know why. Is there a possibility that the student can have a disability? That's where we're at. That's eligibility. That's your eligibility question. But then you have to figure out what kind of disability are we looking for, because you can't just go in and test for everything. You need to have a specific referral question. Now, then you need to think about who's going to be involved in this process. And we're going to discuss that in a little bit. But right now, back to the rationale. Another thing that you can determine is, after a student has been determined to have a special education need, we need to look at the progress. How are we going to measure that? Because that's one of the main questions that the government has in IEP assessment. You know, when they look at how many students come into special education and how many leave, the numbers do not match. And so they want to make sure that students are making progress. It's basically, we're giving you this money, what are you doing with it? And so we have to make sure that students are making progress. And so when we look at things like, you know, that the CBM that we're going to be doing in class, you can use one of these. A CBM is an excellent way to demonstrate academic progress. And you can enter that information, not necessarily the CBM itself, but some of the major information that you get from the CBM, and refer back to it in oncoming IEPs. And in this way, we're going to connect assessment with instruction. All instruction should be connected with assessment in one way or another. Because if you're not assessing as you go along, how do you know how you should change the instruction to better meet the needs of the student? Also, we need to be looking at student strengths and weaknesses. Now you notice I wrote strengths first. Strengths shore up weaknesses. And so that's the area that we need to know. Yeah, we need to know what students don't know so that we can work on those things. But if we use their strengths to help us teach to those weaknesses, they're going to learn much more quickly. And then we're going to need to look at assistive technology. Because as many of you saw in your 305 and 306, assistive technology can be seen as a lot of things. It can be something as small as having a pencil grip on that pen to help that pen or pencil to help the student to not push too hard on their writing utensil thus not tearing their paper, and in turn, not making them so frustrated that they can't complete the assignment. It can also mean having the text already read to them so that they can read along, and thus they're increasing their listening comprehension as well as their reading comprehension at the same time. So there are different ways of, even in what we consider to be low or medium technology, to really be able to shore up those strengths. Then another eligibility or determination that we need to know is what program or treatment program are we going to use? Because if a child has a learning disability in reading, we're not going to put them into a math program if they're fine in math. Makes no sense. If they only have emotional disturbance services, are they going to have reading goals? Maybe, maybe not. They may be fine in that area. What about math goals? If they only have one area, you have to attach to that area. Now, related services, those are those myriad of services that can or cannot be attached depending on what type of parent service meaning the major disability that the student receives. This could be occupational therapy. It could also refer to physical therapy, or some of the other, it could be nursing. They might need a related service of having to be monitored by the nurse if they have say they have diabetes or CP. It might be something that we need to build into that IEP to make sure that they're receiving that service. And a lot of people don't really, think of nursing as a related service. However, by law, it really is. And then another eligibility that often people forget about is exiting from program. Now, this happens a lot in high school, although I have exited a few children from elementary through middle school as well. Now, when they exit from program, we have to test them out. We have to be able to show where they have reached the goals and mastered enough that they're going to be fine without the special education services. And generally what we do is we give them the testing 1 year, we put them on monitor for a year, and then we exit them, because we want to make sure that we're doing the right thing at the right time. Okay, when we talk about rapport, we need to look at establishing effective rapport with the student that you're going to be working with. You want them to come into your room or your office, wherever, when you're in your school environment. But you also want to engage in enough ice-breaking kind of chit-chat that you can gain their cooperation. And so you want to be able to recognize the importance also of building this rapport, because often we have individuals who do not believe that it is important to establish a relationship with the student before they test. Now, if you don't establish that relationship, you're going to have a very, very difficult time getting as much out of that student as they have to give, because they're not going to be motivated to work for you. Then we want to think about the referral question. We need to make sure that those referral questions actually are looking at identifying students that, that we're identifying them based upon the referral information and not just on testing. We don't just test kids. That's not the purpose of it. It's a lot of work for the examiner, but it's even more work for the student. They have to miss class, which means they miss information that's going on in class. And then on top of that, it's stressful. It's extraordinarily stressful for kids to be tested, whether they are in preschool or whether they are in 11th or 12th grade, because they don't really understand what you're doing and what you're going to do with this information. Another problem might be that the data that was presented it wasn't planned. You need to plan what you're going to test, why you're going to test it, and what you are planning on getting out of that information. And another issue can be using quick assessments even if those assessments do not address the areas of concern. Now, this may not seem to be that people would do this, but it happens all the time. Now, finally we come to, this is our last page, and we need to look at instrumentation. We're not going to use poor quality instruments. We want to make sure that when we go through that the manual, that we're looking for the information that's going to tell us this is a well-written examination. Then another problem could be using only administration approved instruments. Now in Florida many years ago, the only instrument that they would accept for IQ was the Wechsler's Intelligence Scale for Children. They would not accept any other IQ score, which meant that retesting was very problematic, because you can only retest with that instrument so many times before the kids learn the questions, which meant that they finally had to talk the state into allowing for something else, because there's several other tests out there that are just as good, and most of them are normed on the Wechsler. Okay, using FAD instruments, what's the coolest thing to use right now? And one of those that I can think of is called the Gordon. Now, it's a little box, and you program it, and then the student will just click on a button as often as they see a certain number come by. And it's a test that we give often to look at ADHD. I personally don't like the test because it's very frustrating for kids to use, because it does test what it's supposed to test, attention. That's what it tests. However, scoring it is problematic, and then giving the information back to parents, especially when that test isn't always acceptable, and it's not always been found to be acceptable in a court of law. To me, that's more of a fad. It's a kind of cool thing to do, but it doesn't really give you a whole lot of information. And then not using a test for the reason that they were written in the first place. Then looking at scoring. Failing to adhere to the administration rules. Not adding correctly, a scoring error. Or not computing the chronological age of the student correctly, which we will be going over that. Ineffectively interpreting assessment results for educational use. And the interpretation issue, we have to know the test and know what the test is doing before we can interpret it. Other mistakes have to do with giving recommendations. Taking the recommendation at face value, not really delving in there and giving a good description of what the tester thinks needs to be done. Misinterpreting reported data. In that way, you're not going to be disseminating or giving that information back correctly. And on top of that, you're not going to be able to give a good recommendation. Failing to document behaviors during the examination that may be of diagnostic value. Because if you don't document those behaviors, then it's going to skew or change your recommendations because you're not going to be giving all of the information back.
you.